March 1945. A Third Army court-martial proceeding is underway in Luxembourg City. Inside a cold stone room, military judges sit behind a long oak table, reviewing a thick stack of legal documents. A black soldier stands perfectly straight before them, his chin held high, while armed guards watch his every move. The charge on the paper is clear, carrying a heavy sentence of up to 20 years in a military prison for striking a superior officer. But the official case file on the table is completely silent about why the punch was thrown. It omits the stench of whiskey, the repeated taunts, and the cruel racial slur hurled at a combat veteran in front of his entire platoon. The military justice system is prepared to punish the reaction while ignoring the ugly provocation that caused it. General George S. Patton is about to review this exact file, and his reaction will stun the courtroom. This is the story of what Patton did when a sergeant faced 20 years for punching the officer who called him a slur. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when prejudice met consequences. Sergeant Marcus Hall was 29 years old, a seasoned combat veteran from Cleveland, Ohio. Before the war, he worked in a steel mill, a quiet man who kept his head down and believed in hard work. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, determined to prove his worth on the front lines. He had spent 16 months in the European theater, moving from the muddy trenches of France to the shattered towns of Belgium. He had seen his close friends fall to German artillery, and he had carried their blood on his uniform. Throughout his entire career, his record was immaculate, completely free of a single disciplinary mark. He had endured whispered insults and systemic cruelty from his own countrymen in silence, choosing to focus entirely on keeping his men alive. But his patience reached its absolute limit when the insult was delivered publicly, destroying his authority in front of the young soldiers who depended on him for survival. Captain Robert Ainsley was 30 years old, an officer from a wealthy estate in Virginia who viewed the military as his personal kingdom. He believed entirely in an unyielding social hierarchy, frequently stating that some men were born to rule while others were born to serve. He wore a custom, tailored wool uniform that remained spotless even in the muddy fields of Luxembourg, and his leather boots were always shined to a high mirror finish. Ainsley had used his family connections to secure quick promotions, avoiding the brutal frontline combat that ordinary soldiers faced daily. His official military file already contained 2 serious incidents involving heavy drinking on duty, but both had been quietly dismissed and buried by influential family friends back home. He treated the black logistics units with open contempt, viewing their presence in Europe as a personal insult to his status. On that cold night, he decided to bring his deep prejudice directly into their barracks. By March 1945, the Allied war machine was roaring across Western Europe, pushing deep into the German heartland. The Third Army was moving at a ferocious pace, tearing through enemy lines and leaving shattered cities in its wake. This unprecedented speed created massive logistical challenges. The front lines moved so rapidly that supply columns had to work around the clock, hauling fuel, ammunition, and rations across thousands of miles of ruined infrastructure. Black logistics units bore the brunt of this exhausting burden, keeping the armored divisions fueled and moving forward. Despite their vital role in the advance, these segregated soldiers faced an entirely separate battle within their own ranks. The American military was deeply divided by Jim Crow regulations, enforcing strict separation between white and black personnel. White officers from affluent backgrounds were frequently placed in command of these supply units, bringing deep-seated prejudices straight to the European theater. Many high-ranking commanders routinely ignored these internal frictions, viewing racial discrimination as a minor nuisance compared to the massive task of defeating the German army. Insults were brushed aside, systemic mistreatment was overlooked, and the official policy was to maintain the status quo at all costs. This permissive environment allowed arrogant officers to abuse their authority without fearing any official reprimand. They operated under the assumption that the chain of command would always protect their rank, regardless of their conduct or sobriety. This widespread complacency created a dangerous powder keg in every camp, waiting for a single spark to ignite a massive confrontation. That dangerous spark finally landed in a cold, damp barracks located in Luxembourg City. Captain Ainsley stumbled through the door of the barracks, his tailored wool uniform disheveled, and a half-empty bottle of military-issue whiskey gripped tightly in his hand. He reeked of alcohol, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused as he surveyed the room where 12 black soldiers were resting. After a grueling 16-hour haul, Sergeant Marcus Hall stood up immediately, saluting with rigid military precision despite the late hour and the clear state of the officer before him. Captain Ainsley did not return the salute, instead choosing to sneer openly as he stepped further into the private living quarters. "Sergeant, why are these men slacking off in a combat zone?" he muttered, his voice thick and slurred. "Sir, the men have just completed a double-shift supply run to the front lines and are ordered to rest." Hall replied calmly. Ainsley stepped directly into Hall's personal space, pointing a shaking finger at a young private sitting on a nearby cot. "I do not care about your excuses, and I do not tolerate laziness from people who belong in the fields," the captain barked, his face flushing red. "Sir, I must respectfully ask you to leave this area," Hall said, keeping his voice level and steady. "You are intoxicated, and these men have earned their mandatory rest." Ainsley laughed loudly, taking another swig from his bottle before slamming it down on a wooden table. "You do not give me orders, boy," he hissed, stepping even closer until he was inches from the sergeant's face. "You think those stripes on your sleeve make you a real soldier, but you are nothing but a common laborer in a uniform. Captain Ainsley, this is your second warning to exit our barracks," Hall stated, his fists clenching at his sides as his men watched in absolute silence. "I will stay right here and say whatever I want to you and your pathetic platoon," Ainsley shouted, using the vile racial slur clearly and deliberately in front of the entire room. The heavy silence in the room broke instantly when Hall's right fist connected squarely with the captain's jaw, sending the intoxicated officer crashing backward into a row of metal lockers. Ainsley groaned on the floor, his face bleeding as he scrambled to his feet and ran out into the cold night, screaming for the military police. Within 20 minutes, armed guards entered the barracks and placed Sergeant Hall under arrest for striking a superior officer. The investigating officer arrived shortly after, refusing to interview a single one of the 12 black witnesses present during the confrontation. He drafted a report that completely omitted Ainsley's drunkenness, his uninvited entry, and the severe racial provocation, leaving Hall facing a mandatory 20-year prison sentence. The biased legal file was processed immediately through the chain of command, and the paperwork reached General Patton's desk within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up directly outside the stone headquarters building in Luxembourg City. The crisp morning air bit at the faces of the guards, but the general sat perfectly rigid, the 4 silver stars on his helmet catching the thin winter sunlight. He wore his immaculately tailored riding breeches, high leather boots, and the twin ivory-handled revolvers buckled tightly around his waist. He walked into the courtroom unannounced, his presence immediately freezing every officer in the room. The murmuring stopped instantly. The military judges sprang to their feet, saluting with panicked precision. Patton did not raise his voice. He walked straight to the center of the floor, his eyes locked on Captain Ainsley, who stood off to the side with a fresh bandage taped across his swollen jaw. "Captain, did you enter the quarters of the logistics platoon uninvited?" Patton asked, his voice low but sharp as a razor. "Yes, General. I was performing a routine readiness inspection," Ainsley replied, shifting his weight. "And did you consume a substantial amount of government-issue whiskey prior to this inspection?" Patton continued, his eyes narrowing. "I had a minor ration after a long shift, sir, but it did not impair my capabilities," the captain muttered. Patton stepped closer, his boots clicking loudly against the stone floor. "Finally, did you point your finger at American soldiers and use a vile racial epithet to describe them in front of their peers?" Ainsley straightened his collar, looking toward the judges for support. "Sir, those men were insubordinate, and a firm reminder of their place, was required to maintain discipline. Patton studied him for a long moment, a cold silence settling over the entire room. "You stand here in a clean uniform, hiding behind influential family names and polished brass," the general said quietly. "You claim you were enforcing discipline, yet you brought the stench of a tavern into a barracks of men who spent 16 hours hauling ammunition through enemy artillery fire. You believe your rank gives you the right to strip a combat veteran of his dignity, but leadership is not a license to abuse the men who keep this army moving forward. Sergeant Marcus Hall stood his ground only after warning you twice to leave his quarters, defending the honor of his uniform while you dragged yours through the mud. You expected this court to hand a brave soldier 20 years in a prison cell to cover up your own drunken cowardice, but this army does not exist to protect your fragile arrogance. You have two options, Captain. You will face a newly convened hearing with all 12 witnesses present, or you will accept the immediate verdict of this command right now. Decide in the next 10 seconds. Ainsley looked at the general's unyielding expression, his face draining of all color as he whispered his compliance. General Patton turned toward the military guards, waiting at the back of the stone courtroom, and gave a single, sharp nod. The guards moved forward immediately, their boots clicking heavily against the floor as they approached Captain Ainsley. They did not treat him with the deference usually reserved for a company commander, instead gripping his arms firmly and stripping the polished silver bars from his shoulders. Ainsley watched in stunned silence as his unearned authority was physically taken away in front of the entire assembly. The guards escorted him out of the room and directly into the cold afternoon air, where the 12 black soldiers of the logistics platoon were standing in a straight formation. Patton walked out behind them, ordering the entire base personnel to assemble in the courtyard to witness the public degradation. Ainsley smelled the damp earth and the exhaust of waiting supply trucks as he was forced to stand before the very men he had insulted. The guards read the new charges aloud, stripping him of his premium assignment and ordering an immediate fine against his pay. The surrounding white officers watched in absolute shock, realizing the old system would no longer protect their arrogance, while the black soldiers stood tall, seeing a rare flash of real accountability. Sergeant Marcus Hall returned to his platoon in Luxembourg City the morning after the charges were rewritten. His men greeted him with quiet nods of respect, their bond tightened by an ordeal that could have broken them. He remained with his logistics unit through the end of the European campaign, ensuring the vital supply trucks never stopped rolling until the final surrender in May. When the war concluded, he went home to Cleveland, Ohio, returning to his old job at the steel mill. He married, raised 3 children, and lived a long, peaceful life, rarely talking about his time in theater to anyone outside his immediate family. He passed away quietly in 1982, carrying the memory of the day his dignity was validated by the most feared general in the Army. Captain Robert Ainsley spent the final months of the war assigned to a desolate supply depot far behind the active lines, stripped of his command authority. His influential family back home attempted to restore his reputation, but the official reprimand in his military record blocked any future advancement. He returned to his Virginia estate in late 1945, bitter and reclusive, watching the changing world pass him by from behind his iron gates. He lived a comfortable but deeply isolated life, remaining entirely unrepentant about his actions until his death in 1974. General Patton never spoke publicly about the incident, choosing to keep the details of the court-martial out of his official press briefings. He kept the rewritten investigation file inside his personal desk drawer until his tragic death in December 1945. In a private letter written to his wife just weeks after the hearing, he noted that a true commander protects his men from enemies both outside and inside the uniform, stating simply that courage wears no color. Some historians have argued that General Patton's handling of the incident was primarily driven by a pragmatic desire to maintain maximum operational efficiency during a critical phase of the Allied advance. They contend that his swift intervention was a calculated move to prevent widespread unrest within the vital logistics units, ensuring that the supply lines keeping his armored columns moving remained completely uninterrupted. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that his decision reflected a genuine, deeply held belief in an absolute standard of military justice that superseded social prejudices and traditional hierarchies. What is certain is that the official record of the proceeding stood as a stark and undeniable precedent, demonstrating that even during the height of a global conflict, an officer's rank would not shield him from the consequences of abusing his authority. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have quietly filed the report away to avoid a political scandal within the high command? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when prejudice met consequences, make sure to subscribe.